About 4 years ago, I made a video on the top 10 unkilled raid bosses, going over bosses that took the most amount of time to be able to defeat it from the point raiders were actually able to do attempts on the boss. Although that old video is poorly edited and missing a lot of context, which is what this Reforged version is going to add into it. And at number 10, we have heroic 25-man Alakir. This boss was defeated 36 days after the first guild started working on it. Now, in modern world first races, generally a kill on the final boss is done after about 2 weeks. And Alakir is a somewhat modern raid boss, being the final boss of the 2-person raid at the beginning of Cataclysm. So it's kind of unusual that it took so long to defeat, at little over a month of attempts. So what took so long in order to kill Alakir? Well, besides the fact that Cataclysm introduced controversial healing changes that made the game a lot harder, during Phase 1, Alakir has an ability called Lightning Strike that would target a random player with the ability, which would shock them with lightning, put a dot on them for 24 seconds, and chain to all nearby allies. The problem with this ability was simply the amount of space on the platform. With the full 25-man raid group, it was nearly impossible to avoid a whole bunch of people getting hit with Lightning Strike and taking massive amounts of damage, especially since it left that long dot afterwards, which isn't in the normal difficulty at all. And because there's so much movement on the fight, it was kind of hard to assign positions for this ability. And eventually, they would just get to a point where everyone got the dot on them, or too many of them got it and they were just taking way too much damage to heal through. But Paragon, the only guild to down this boss before they nerfed the Lightning Strike ability, found a way to handle this mechanic, by simply having 7 people from the raid just sit out during Phase 1. Literally, they just had people wait for Phase 1 to be over before joining the fight, because they could not deal with the Lightning Strike mechanic. So it's kind of easy to figure out why no one else was able to get a kill, when the answer was to have 1/3 of your raid team sit out for one phase of the fight. After Paragon got their first kill, Blizzard immediately nerfed the encounter. They lowered the damage on Lightning Strike, they lowered the dot duration by 1/3, and they also made it so people couldn't jump into the fight with the slipstreams, so that no one could stay out in order to sit out Phase 1. This has got to be one of the few fights in the game's history where the answer to solving an overtuned mechanic was to actually have less players. And at number 9, we have heroic 25-man Lich King, which took 42 days to kill after being available to kill. So what took the Lich King so long to down? Well, the Lich King makes it on my list of the top 10 hardest raid bosses of all time video. So that's kind of it. It was just one of the hardest raid bosses they've ever added to the game for a whole bunch of different reasons, including a little bit of overtuning. That's a really good way Blizzard makes a boss a lot harder, by just having him hit super hard or just have way too much health for the amount of gear available. Generally, whenever Blizzard nerfs a raid boss, they just lower his health because that makes the DPS race easier. However, in Icecrown Citadel, there is no need to nerf the boss because there was already a mechanic put in place which would just buff the players instead, where after an amount of time, players would start getting a stacking buff that would increase basically everything they do by 5%. Capping out at 30% after enough time. And since they had this mechanic in place from the get-go, and everyone knew it was going to be incorporated eventually, they never actually thought to cut back on the tuning of Lich King, because they knew eventually someone would be able to get the kill once the buff went out, which is exactly what happened, as the first kill was achieved after the 5% buff went live, which was the very first tick of it. Although it wasn't just a little bit of overtuning that happened, really another one of the big reasons the fight took so long to kill was because it existed in the era of limited attempts. Limited attempts meant raid groups working on the boss only had 50 attempts total per week. It was Blizzard's way of trying to force top players to have more quality attempts, rather than just throwing themselves against the wall of an endless amount of attempts before they eventually got a kill on a boss. It was an experiment that eventually failed, since no one really liked the mechanic, and it just forced players to get more attempts on their alts before trying real attempts on their main characters. So now limited attempts is only used for limited duration bosses, and the last time we had limited attempts was on Raw Den in the Throne of Thunder during Mists of Pandaria. And at number 8 we have Alar, Phoenix God, who was killed 48 days after it was available. Alar was technically the first boss in the instance, although you could skip the boss if you wanted to. It wasn't needed to kill in order to work on the final boss Kel'Thas, who himself took a really long time to kill, clocking in at 31 days after it was available to do attempts on, which would place Kel'Thas at number 11 on this list, if it went higher than 10. So what was so difficult about the fight? Well, a lot of bosses in the first year of raiding for the Burning Crusade were just kind of buggy or ridiculously overtuned. Like more so than anything we have today, although there was only 2 main problems with Alar, unlike the 1,000,001 problems that plagued Kael'thas, where Alar would sometimes randomly charge a raid member and kill them, and there wasn't really much you could do about that. And the other one was where he would cast his Meteor ability. You needed everyone to stack so that whoever was targeted wouldn't die instantly, so that you could split the damage with him. Only it did so much damage that it was nearly impossible to deal with. So instead, you would just let the person targeted die, and then just battle res them later. Although that required a lot of battle reses, since it was a frequent normal mechanic of the fight. So, what some guilds would do is just have an army of low-level warlock ults, so that they could place soulstones on each other before pulling the boss each time. That way, everyone had their own personal battle res ready, as that was something you could still do back in the Burning Crusade before Blizzard fixed this later on in WoW's history. So with the fact that it was also an optional boss, and people were more interested in working on the final boss instead, plus with its overtune on the damage, it's no wonder it took as long as it did. And at number 7, we have the Four Horsemen from Naxxramas, killed 56 days after it was available. Now this one is nearing on the 2-month mark, and took so long to kill because of a very unique mechanic that the boss had. You see, it had the really unique distinction of requiring 8 tanks with a taunt in order to deal with its mechanics, where you had to fight 4 bosses at once, and each boss had their own tank swap mechanic, which wasn't really possible with the standard amount of tanks from a 40-man raid. There were a couple of bosses that required around 5 to 6 tanks, but none of them required 8 of them, and 8 of them that required a taunt to land. Generally, tanks were not hit capped with their taunt, especially since taunt was considered a spell, so it had a 16% chance to miss by default, and the only way they could get near the hit cap was by getting the 4-set bonus from tier 3, which you farmed inside of Naxxramas itself, which increased your chance to hit with taunt by 5%. It still wouldn't give you the hit cap, but it was needed in order to get your hit cap close enough, because if you had too many missed taunts in a row, you could just wipe. Because generally, tank swaps weren't done with hard taunts, as a lot of bosses were just straight up immune to them in the early days of the game. So having to farm a 4-set bonus from the raid itself on 8 different characters, who were all potentially competing for the same loot, was quite difficult. And even if you got the required gear, there was still a chance your taunt could be resisted and just have a lot of wipes due to too many taunt resists in a row. So what a lot of guilds would do in order to accomplish this task was to simply steal warrior tanks from other raids that already had the 4-set bonus. And it just encouraged a lot of cannibalizing other raids in order to get the required tanks in order to down the fight. So because of the tank and gear requirements of the fight, it obviously took a long time in order to accomplish this. In classic WoW, the fight worked the same way, but was downed in the first day of its release instead of after 56 days. And at number 6, we have High Astromancer Solarian, who was killed 59 days after it was available to do. This is another boss from Tempest Keep, just like Alar the Phoenix God, except this one was actually necessary to kill in order to start working on Kael'thas. So what made it take so long to kill? Well, it was just kind of ridiculously hard. She had a couple of mechanics in the fight, where she would put out a mark on everyone, which would lower your arcane resistance, and she would periodically put a bomb on someone, which would explode and leave behind a debuff, which increased the arcane damage you took, and then would jump to a nearby player. And she would almost exclusively use arcane attacks, which also completely ignored any arcane resistance the player had. So, she was hitting people incredibly hard, because this is also the time when negative resistance would cause all kinds of problems with damage modifiers, and cause spells to hit for way harder than they really should have been. So in the first version, she was basically unkillable, and they weren't really as fast on fixing unkillable bosses back then as they are today. So when they did eventually get around to trying to fix the fight, first what they did was lower her health by about 30%, which is a gigantic nerf to HP, I might add. You rarely hear about HP nerfs that big. If they nerf a boss's health by more than 10%, you know they messed up somewhere. Then, they just removed the mechanic that put negative arcane resistance on people. Later on, they also changed their bomb ability to no longer put a debuff on targets that increased the arcane damage they took. And they also made it so it wouldn't jump to nearby targets anymore. Then, in her third version, they changed it so the arcane resistance would be much more effective versus her spells, which led to arcane resistance tanks and made the fight almost a cakewalk. So, she went to impossible to kill to the easiest boss of the instance by the end of it. And at number 5, we have Yogg-Saron, Alone in the Darkness, or Zero Lights, which was done 70 days after the first guild got a kill on 1 light in the darkness. Alone in the Darkness was just the hardest mode version of Yogg-Saron, where you kill the boss without any of the keepers helping you, and the fight is obviously designed around having the keepers help you, so it was ridiculously difficult, and easily the hardest hard mode trigger of any boss in the game's history, since there aren't really too many bosses that have hard mode triggers anyway. So the way the guilds would deal with this was just by playing the fight perfectly and making sure they lost no sanity, since they had no way to get it back. Although, even if you did the fight perfectly, there was still one phase of the fight that was almost impossible, especially with how low your damage was, since not having any of the keepers help meant you didn't get that amazing DPS boost as well. Because there were a couple of adds which would spawn during the last phase, and they would do damage based on how much health they had left. So what you would do to deal with them was just kill them as fast as possible, and the damage would go down and they'd become a lot more manageable. Except these adds could not die, unless you had one of the specific keepers helping you, so they would just kind of hang around at 1 health forever, which wasn't a big deal because you could just have one of your tanks hold on to them for as long as you needed to. Except for the fact that there was this little mechanic called Shadow Beacon. Shadow Beacon was a buff that Yogg-Saron would cast on one of his adds, which after 10 seconds would explode in a 20-yard radius and heal everything caught in the explosion. And since it was such a rapid heal, if a Shadow Beacon went off on a group of adds that was being held, it would heal them all back up to full really fast and cause the tank to die almost instantly. And then all of these newly full health adds would just run around the room killing everyone else. And in order to deal with this mechanic, you basically just had to have more tanks in the group. That way you could have more taunts for the add and just have that Shadow Beacon moved out of the group. That way it would explode by itself without hitting anything else. Although, that's where the problem of the no keepers came in. If you ran more tanks to deal with this mechanic, then you simply would just not have enough damage to kill the boss before his hard enrage timer. And you also had to be really quick about pulling the Shadow Beacon targets out, because it had a pretty big radius when it would explode. So, how they ended up dealing with this mechanic was by simply running 2 hunters who would use their distracting shot in order to taunt and kite the add with the Shadow Beacon out of the group, and then let the add run back to the group after it exploded, since it would still have aggro on the tank after the distracting shot duration ended. Although there were a couple of other things which would instantly wipe the group, so eventually after around 500 attempts they finally got the kill. And then later on they nerfed Yogg-Saron's health by about 20%, which made the DPS check a lot more reasonable and required a lot less kiting. And at number 4 we have Ragnaros, killed 74 days after it was available. And of course we're talking about vanilla WoW Ragnaros. So what was the cause of this boss taking so long to be killed? Well, it was just new, and people in vanilla WoW were just new in general to World of Warcraft, and people were still leveling to max, so there wasn't a lot of people available for it, and just a whole bunch of other factors that weren't really tied to the boss itself. This one's basically purely on here because raiding at the very beginning of WoW was just very new and everyone was pretty bad. And at number 3, we have Chromaggus, killed 74 days after it was available, tied with Ragnaros. Chromaggus was the second to last boss in Blackwing Lair, which was the second raid added to the game. Now, what made this fight difficult, or the reason it took so long to kill, was because it was a lot more moving parts at once, which made it kind of difficult for the early raiders to deal with, where they weren't really used to having too many raid mechanics yet. Chromaggus had a total of around 3 big mechanics to deal with. One of them was his breath weapon he would use, where he would do a cone attack that generally you could just LOS with the raid hiding behind a wall. And he would just have 2 random breaths every time you entered the instance, out of the potential 5 different breaths that he could use. So some weeks were just easier than others, and the hardest week were the ones where he had the time-lapse breath, which would stun the tanks and reduce the threat for the duration. As with all the other breaths, the raid could basically just avoid them, but they would sometimes have to take at least 1 hit from the time-lapse breath, so that the tanks wouldn't lose all their aggro. He would also periodically shuffle between damage types he was resistant or vulnerable to, so you had to be careful of what kind of damage you were using, otherwise you would just waste your precious mana attacking him when he would just resist all your spells. And he would just constantly put out debuffs on the raid of all different damage types, so healers were constantly having to dispel everyone so they wouldn't be killed if they had all 5 debuffs on them at once. And one of the debuffs could not be dispelled by the healer, and instead you had to use an item called Hourglass Sand, which dropped in limited quantities from trash mobs in the instance, which was generally just given out to high priority targets in the raid, and everyone else just had to deal with being periodically stunned throughout the fight from that debuff. When it comes to modern raids, this isn't really that big of a deal, But in Vanilla WoW, this was on par with one of the hardest raid fights ever that any of them had done. And this was after the wall of the boss that was Valistraz the Corrupt, the second boss of the instance, which was so difficult in early WoW that it was the cause of a lot of guilds just straight up disbanding. So with so many people stuck on Valistraz, that could also explain why Chromaggus took as long as he did. And at number 2, we have Cthulhu, killed 86 days after it was available. This is another vanilla boss and the final boss of AQ40, and is considered by many as the hardest boss of all time. Now, I'm not sure if that's true or not, but he did have some ridiculous bugs that made him almost unkillable before they were fixed. One of the biggest ones was in his stomach room. You see, periodically throughout the fight, he would teleport people into his stomach, and they would have to DPS tentacles in order to get out. However, you also had to deal with them outside the stomach like a normal raid boss, and he would just target people at random to put inside his stomach. So it was possible for him to just pick all your healers and throw them into his stomach, where they just wouldn't have the damage to kill the ad needed to get out. And of course, people upstairs would just die to the damage since they had no healers anymore. Also, a really big one, periodically he would attack people with a chain lightning ability, so you had to make sure you were constantly spread out while you were upstairs. Although, there was a bug where he would periodically target people inside his stomach with the chain lightning as well. And since the mechanics of the stomach room were to stand on one of 3 platforms, everyone inside was always stacked up. So if he targeted someone with chain lightning inside his stomach, it was basically death for everyone down there. And this is just on top of everything else being difficult, so a combination of bugs that made the fight impossible, and a tiny bit of over-tuning created a boss that lives for an incredibly long time. After hotfix went live that fixed most of these bugs, he was killed about a day later. And at number 1, we have Ouro, another boss from AQ40, who was killed 87 days after it was available, 1 day after Cthulhu. Now, the reason Ouro went unkilled for so long is basically the same reason as Cthulhu. It had a couple of bugs that made the fight almost unkillable. And coupled with the fact that it was an optional boss, means no one really worked on it anyway and spent all their efforts fighting Cthulhu instead. So, there were 2 big bugs with the fight. One of them was with its Sandblast ability, where it would do a cone that would hit and stun everyone as well as wiping the tank's threat. So it would then turn to the second highest target to do it again, and that was the end of it. It was meant to go off 2 times and you would just have your tanks put it off in 2 separate directions so it wouldn't hit the raid group. However, the ability would actually cast 4 times before he stopped doing it, and he would do them all back to back, which wasn't really doable, as it would eventually hit the group and deal about 90% of everyone's health as damage, which wasn't really healable when everyone was also stunned afterwards. Now, if you managed to deal with his Sandblast ability, he would also have another phase where he would go underground and spawn ants, although sometimes he would just never come up, so you couldn't actually hit him because he just bugged out. So when they finally fixed Cthulhu and people finally got the kill they wanted, they went back to Ouro to see if he had been fixed too, and he was, so they got a kill pretty easily right afterwards. Ouro basically hit number 1 on this list because no one really cared about him, despite the fact that he was difficult as well, because he was just horribly bugged, which is ironic because he's a big bug himself. Alright, and that's the video. A reforged version of one I made 4 years ago, which is currently the 2nd most viewed video on my channel. A lot of people didn't like the original title of the video because it's called Top 10 Unkilled Raid Bosses, which makes sense. It implies there are bosses which still haven't been killed yet, instead of ones that just went unkilled the longest, which is why the remake version has a more accurate title. And also a lot more details on the fights than whatever the hell I used to do back in the day. Pretty much all of my videos from before 2018 are pretty bad, so I'd like to remake most of the good ones.